All right, so now we're going to do the movements in the muscles that move the talotibial joint, and then we'll look at the subtalar or talocalcaneal joint. So again, we have the talus is distal, the tibia is proximal, the distal end of the tibia forms the proximal component of the joint. The talus, actually the superior surface, forms the distal end of the joint. And that joint is uniaxial. It moves in dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. Sagittal plane with a frontal axis. So if I show you this axis here going through the medial and lateral malleoli, okay? Now, any muscle that falls in front of this axis here is going to dorsiflex, which means any muscle that falls behind is going to pull the talotibial joint into plantar flexion. So the prime mover for dorsiflexion is the anterior tibialis. Does the name tell you anything? Yep, anterior tibia. Okay. And it comes from the anterolateral. Now instead of attaching to the top of the foot, it actually comes around to the first cuneiform and metatarsal plantar surface. So not only is it a dorsiflexor, but it's also an inverter because it falls medial to the axis for the subtalar joint. Hi, Trevor. Trevor, you want to be in the video too? Yep, here's Trevor wants to learn his muscles too. So that's the anterior tibialis, is a prime mover for dorsiflexion because it falls in front of this axis, the frontal axis, and it's an inverter because it falls medial to the sagittal axis. Anterior tibialis is innervated by the deep peroneal nerve. That common peroneal nerve that we talked about last week divides at the level of the fibular head into a deep branch that comes anterior and a superficial branch that stays lateral. So that is the anterior tibialis, dorsiflexor prime mover, but we're also going to see it as an inverter. Now the plantar flexors, let's try not to knock down the old skeleton, we said had to be behind the axis, making them plantar flexors. So in layers, we have the two-jointed gastrocnemius. It actually originates on the medial and lateral femoral condyle, crosses the knee joint. You got it. It's a twofer. Going to flex the knee, comes down, crosses behind that joint axis via the Achilles tendon to the calcaneus. So it is a plantar flexor and a knee flexor. Now I'm not going to tell you the answer on this video, but I want you to figure out how would I make the gastrocnemius actively insufficient if I show you that its actions are knee flexion and ankle talotibial plantar flexion. That's all I'm going to say. On the other side, I want you to tell me how you would stretch it. We'll leave that out for lab. Now underneath the gastrocnemius is another plantar flexor called the soleus. Now I'm hoping you can see that it can't move the knee as it doesn't cross the tibiofemoral joint. It joins the gastrocnemius to become a common tendon, the Achilles, and again inserts into the calcaneus. So a good plantar flexor because it crosses behind the axis, that frontal axis for the sagittal plane. The gastrocnemius and the soleus are innervated by the tibial nerve. Any muscle, and there's a lot of them, some of them we're not even going to study, whose belly is in the posterior calf area is innervated by the tibial nerve, which is the continuation of the sciatic nerve, tibial nerve. All right, so we had the dorsiflexor anterior tibialis, the plantar flexor, gastrocnemius and soleus. Let's go back and look at that subtalar joint. Okay, so here's our axis for the subtalar joint. So any muscle that falls medial is going to be an inverter, like the anterior tibialis. Any muscle that falls lateral over here is going to be an everter. So we already looked at the anterior tibialis, but so good. Let's look at it again. Anterior tibia crosses over medially. So not only is it a dorsiflexor, but it is an inverter. And then we also have one from behind, deep to the soleus, is the posterior tibialis. So posterior tibia, the interosseous membrane, which is a ligament, and then the fibula, that's the origin. So it comes down, it wraps around, here's an example of a pulley, the medial malleolus, and you're going to love this. It inserts on the bottom of the foot most of the bones, most of the tarsals and metatarsals. Now I need to show it accurately. It goes behind the axis for the sagittal plane, which we said was right here. So if you guess that it's a plantar flexor, let me make it real, it goes behind the malleolus. It is a plantar flexor with the gastrocnemius and soleus, but it falls medial to this axis, so it's an inverter. All right, last but not least, we have two muscles that fall lateral to this axis. We have the peroneus longus, so just below the head of the fibula, behind the lateral malleolus, and it goes all the way over to the first cuneiform and metatarsal, okay? But because it falls lateral to the subtalar joint axis, hopefully you guys can all see that it is an everter. There's a shorter everter, the peroneus brevis, starts mid-shaft behind the lateral malleolus over to that tibial tuberosity. And again, hopefully you can see it being a strong everter. Now both the peroneus brevis and the peroneus longus fall close to, but behind the axis for the sagittal plane, so they're also assisting movers for plantar flexion. Okay? Peroneus longus and brevis, superficial perineal nerve. Remember, the common perineal nerve divided, it innervated the short head of the biceps femoris, splits right around the fibular head to become the superficial and the deep. The deep goes to the anterior tibialis, superficial perineal to the peroneus longus and brevis. Good.